There's an actual criminal in the White House right now, and it's a threat to the United States and the world. We need to have a serious conversation about this. Check it out. Leave your comments. Ding the bell. Share with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. I wanted to talk about the Republican complaints. I mean, one of the most fascinating things, with regard to the impeachment process, and also, and I'm going to get into this in a few minutes. Can a president actually be arrested for a crime? And what would be, what are some of the really weird scenarios that we could game out of this? But I think one of the most important or interesting things about all these Republican complaints, including their stunt yesterday, invading the SCIF, the secure meeting area where the number 3 person in the Department of Defense was being questioned by Republicans and Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee. Over a dozen of the people who showed up to do the Brooks Brothers riot thing were actually members of the committee. They were Republican members of the committee who could have been sitting in the room interrogating the witness. And in fact, after their little stunt was over, went back to sitting in the room interrogating the witnesses. I mean, it was just a rather pathetic thing. But the point is that they are no longer arguing that Donald Trump is not a criminal, that Donald Trump hasn't committed crimes that are worthy of impeachment, that he did. They're no longer arguing that he didn't commit, for example, campaign finance fraud. I mean, his lawyer's in prison for that right now. And he's an unindicted co-conspirator. He's named in Michael Cohen's, in the indictment of Michael Cohen as individual 1. That's Donald Trump. I mean, it's been acknowledged in court. They're no longer arguing that he didn't basically shake down the president of Ukraine trying to get dirt on Joe Biden and his son. The transcript is out there. You can't pretend it's not. So what they're doing now is they're trying to blow up the process. They're claiming that Trump can't be prosecuted even if he breaks the law. Yesterday, they went in and his lawyers in federal court went in and said, if he shoots somebody, which was the example that Donald Trump himself gave, if he shoots and kills somebody, the cops can't even stop him, much less investigate him. I mean, the fact is that this guy, Donald Trump, has been a lifelong grifter and small-time crook, and he's keeping his tax returns secret for one of 2 reasons. Either he is broke, which is what David K. Johnston has been speculating for years, and he doesn't want anybody to know because his whole persona is that he's a rich guy. And if he was broke, he'd have to admit that he lost all that, the 400 and some odd million dollars that he got from his daddy. Much of it, without taxes because of a tax fraud that he committed that caused his sister to have to resign from the federal bench to avoid investigation. So, a genuine criminal in the White House. This is a threat to the future of democracy, frankly, in the world. As Russian soldiers are moving into Syria right now to fill the space occupied by the departing American soldiers. After we had to blow up our own bases, we had to bring in, fighter jets to drop bombs on our own bases. As the Kurds are throwing tomatoes at our Humvees as we're pulling out. I mean, it's crazy. Which raises a really interesting scenario, all of this stuff. The argument that the president made yesterday or the president's lawyer, Trump's lawyers made yesterday in federal court, that even if he was seen by a police officer committing murder, that police officer not only could not investigate the murder, but that police officer could not stop him from committing another murder. Which provoked one of my brothers to send me what I think is probably the most brilliant, this is the ad absurdum or ad absurdum or however you say it in Latin. When you push a logical argument all the way to its absurd limit. My brother, one of my brothers, wrote this absolutely brilliant thing. He says, Tom, I watched the news yesterday and learned that Trump's attorney said that a sitting president cannot be stopped for killing anyone or even charged for killing them. So my scenario, now let me just preface this by saying that this scenario that my brother laid out is going to require a certain amount of self-sacrifice on the part of, he's using Joe Biden as an example, but whoever it might be. But anyhow, here it is. He says, so my scenario is Biden gets the nomination and picks Warren to be vice president. The Senate goes Democratic. After being sworn in, Biden buys an AR-15 online and goes to the Supreme Court and shoots 5 Republican justices. No one can stop him because of the president's, argument. He then goes back to the White House and sends 5 progressive names to the Democratic Senate for justices. The House starts impeachment because he just killed 5 people. And the Senate confirms the 5 justices. The Senate then votes impeachment. Biden is kicked out, and Elizabeth Warren becomes president. Biden is charged and gives up his right to trial and is convicted. He's given a life sentence and goes to prison. The next day, President Warren pardons Biden. Biden gets out. You've got 5. I mean, this is actually, he says, this is a possible scenario. And yeah, it is. I mean, it's pretty impossible in the real world, but following the logic of Donald Trump's lawyers, it's possible, which shows how absurd it is. I mean, Robert Mueller, for example, throughout, he kept saying, yeah, I mean, he said in public on a couple occasions, but it's also in part 2 of the Mueller report, that if we could find that Donald Trump was innocent of these things, we would have said so. He actually used a double negative, but which made it more complicated and harder to understand, but that's essentially what he said. And we did not. We did not say so. In other words, clearly Donald Trump was guilty of, at the very least, multiple instances of the crime of obstruction of justice, trying to obstruct the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. But, Mueller said, we can't bring charges against him because the Justice Department says we can't. And they've said, the Justice Department has said that you can't indict a sitting president ever since 1974, when Nixon was being impeached. And the question was, is it possible? I mean, Nixon obviously committed crimes. It came out that Jimmy Hoffa had given him $1 million bribe. It came out that the milk lobby had given him a $500,000 bribe. Their lobbyist had walked into the White House with a suitcase full of $100 bills. Nixon took it. Same thing with the Jimmy Hoffa bribe. I mean, it came out that Nixon actually committed crimes. Tax fraud was another one. But Nixon, by the way, was the last president who refused to release his taxes until the impeachment hearing was able to get a hold of them. And then they found, hey, sure enough, this guy's committing tax fraud. So, I mean, this is how weird it gets. Now, let me take it a step further. Well, first of all, it was the Nixon Department of Justice, presumably under John Mitchell. I'd have to go back and look at the timeline, but keep in mind, Mitchell went to prison himself for 19 months for the crimes that he committed as Trump's Attorney General. But it was the Nixon Department of Justice that said you can't prosecute a sitting president. And then the issue got revisited again in 2000 when Bill Clinton was president, and the Republicans, who had unsuccessfully tried to remove him from office, successfully impeached him in the House of Representatives. The Republicans wanted to charge Bill Clinton with crimes. And so Bill Clinton's Department of Justice issued an opinion on it, which I read 2 weeks ago. It's fairly long. It's like 40, 50 pages. It takes a couple hours to really read carefully and understand. And, I get their arguments. The core of the argument is the president is doing such vital work and is so busy and has so much responsibility that you can't burden him with having to defend himself in court. But it's hard to make that argument when this guy spends, Trump spends literally he spent 2/3 of the time he's been in the White House on his own golf courses, playing golf. I mean, he could spend that time defending himself against a crime. So the question, is it possible to arrest a president and prosecute him for a crime? That question actually has already been answered. And I'm guessing that the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice in 1974 simply didn't know this little bit of history. But in 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant was speeding in Washington, D.C. He was driving all by himself. He was driving a horse-drawn carriage, which is, this is before cars, down the street really, really fast. There were a bunch of these, kind of wealthy, rich guys who like to speed their carriages down 13th Street in Washington, D.C., which is a pretty big avenue. And he was stopped. He was stopped for speeding, and the cop let him off. The cop, by the way, his name was William H. West. He was an African-American who had fought in the Civil War. And he was a policeman. And he let him off with a warning. And then 2 days later, President Grant is speeding down the same street again, and Policeman West stops him at the corner of 13th and M and says, okay, that's 2 strikes, you're going to jail. And he literally took the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, to jail. And Grant paid $20 to bail himself out. And then the next, a week or so later, a trial was held. And this is from a news report from the Star, it used to be a Washington, D.C. newspaper. 32 ladies of the most refined character and surroundings voluntarily came into the court and testified against the drivers. Grant was one of 3 or 4 guys who were arrested for speeding. The cases were contested bitterly, but the judge imposed heavy fines and a scathing rebuke to the speeding drivers. Can a president be arrested? Well, it's already happened. But my brother's scenario is the most, extraordinary extension of this bizarre logic.